Hi everyone, my name is Glenn Savage. I'm an Associate Professor of Education Futures at the Faculty of Education at the University of Melbourne. I'm sorry I can't be there in person today, but it's a pleasure to be able to share some ideas with you virtually. Over the past few years, I've been giving a lot of thought to what we understand evidence to be, how evidence is used in education policy and reform, and also how system leaders and education leaders navigate evidence in their own practice. One of the main arguments that I've been making in this work is that the past few decades of education reform in Australia, but also globally, have gotten things around the wrong way. In other words, we're putting the system together backwards rather than putting students and inspiration and creativity at the heart of learning and then asking what would it look like to produce that. Education reforms have instead been subject to an agenda of standardization, one size fits all approaches, and an obsession with finding the evidence that tells us what works. I've argued that this approach has many damaging consequences and has also not delivered the results. In fact, if we look at our nation's schooling systems, after more than 2 decades of reforms that have promised to align systems across the nation to evidence and reforms based on what works, we've actually seen Australian schooling performance stagnate or decline on almost every major measure that's used to assess progress. And to me, this raises a major dilemma. Does what works actually not work at all? In 2021, I published a book called The Quest for Revolution in Australian Schooling Policy. And in the book, I argue that part of the reason that what works isn't working is because of the logics of reform, kind of like the deeper underpinning imagination of reform. And I argue that these have been captured by a false hope in what I call alignment thinking. And so when I use this term alignment thinking, what I'm talking about is almost a seductive allure of order, that assumes that we'll get positive outcomes if we can just make sure everyone is doing what's proven to work. So in this vision, educators are kind of reimagined or reframed as technicians who should adopt clinical and highly standardized practices based on common bodies of evidence. Now, since writing that book, I've been working a lot with policymakers and educators to argue that we need to think differently about evidence. And I actually wrote a recent article in the journal Australian Education Leader that I've sent through to James and Brad to distribute if people want to have a read. In that article, I actually draw on my passion for gardening and for permaculture in order to critique the what works logic. And in doing that, my aim is not to argue against evidence. And I often say, who would want to go into a classroom doing what doesn't work or having no idea why you're doing the things that you're doing. So I'm not arguing against evidence, but instead I argue that we need to think differently about it, what we understand it to be and how we use it. Too often, I think there's a flawed presumption at work that believes that it is actually possible to find universal solutions that are applicable to all contexts. And I've argued that this approach has had really problematic implications, especially in schools, but also universities, because it's dampened the creativity of educators and their capacity to exert their own professional expertise to adapt evidence to local contexts and needs. So another side effect of this, I think, as well, and this really is a rigid way of thinking, but a side effect of this sort of rigid thinking has been we've seen the emergence of very binary debates about evidence and about learning. So anyone in a school right now would know that we have these two camps. Are we doing direct or explicit instruction? And that's seen as something completely opposed to inquiry-based or project-based learning. If you're an English teacher like I used to be in a previous life, we have the phonics or reading wars. Basically, we have all these hard lines in the sand around which evidence is seen to be the right one. And I'm sure that you have your version of this in music education. So in my work, using this sort of gardening analogy, I've argued that, like a good gardener, who would understand that each plant requires unique conditions to thrive. I would argue that the best educators understand that we are tending not to a faceless collective of students, but instead to individuals with diverse ecosystems of thought, with diverse backgrounds, potentials, and experiences. So humans are obviously infinitely more complex than plants are. Yet I would argue that so many of our education policies and practices treat students as if the key to their future lies in just applying the same off-the-shelf solution to all of them, much like the industrial fertilizers and magic growth solutions that you'll find in the aisle at your local hardware store. Now, this argument that I'm making owes a lot to my own experiences in the world of permaculture, and you could talk a lot about that, and we'll hold off doing it. But I've applied a lot of that thinking from the garden to argue that in education we're thinking about this wrong. We should never abstract solutions from context. And in the garden, we know that the success of a crop is contingent not only on the foundations of the soil itself, but also on the varying inputs that we apply. So what works in one setting might not work in another setting. And I think acknowledging this complexity is crucial. So if you came to me and said, look, this is what works to grow a tomato, I would say that statement makes no sense, because the very notion of the solution of what works should never have been abstracted from context in the first place. So long story short, I strongly believe that the current stagnation that we're seeing in our education systems are because we've spent too long treating all students like they're the same tomato growing in the same conditions. We've forgotten that what it would take to grow and to thrive in a learning environment in, say, Broome or South Perth or St Kilda can in some cases be very, very different. Now, there'll always be some elements of learning that we need to share in common. Just like every tomato has certain basic needs. But I think if we want true growth and flourishing, then we need more than just the basics. So looking to the future, I think many aspects of our education systems need a radical rethink. We must move away from the industrial model of reform, which really does treat students and teachers like products on an assembly line. I think we need to embrace a more organic and more holistic approach. And this requires a reframing of the very question about what works, because I think this question about what works is actually the wrong question. I think instead we should be adding just two words to that question, which would be what might work here. What might work here for me in this context? And to me, this question is a good one. And it's of fundamental importance if we want to place inspiration and passion at the heart of our efforts for education and at the heart of the ways that we understand and engage with evidence. So I believe that it's only through experimentation with evidence in context that we'll really know if something works for us or not. Rather than treating context, though, as an afterthought, we should always start with context, or start with the here and the now, both in terms of where we are, but where we aspire to be. And if we can do this, I think we can really tap into and understand what makes our students spark, what brings them alive, and what inspires them as learning. So in summary, I would compel all of you to reject the false certainty of magic bullet solutions, the false certainty of the what works logic, and to instead luxuriate in the messy, the challenging, but the ultimately fascinating work of navigating evidence in order to grow a garden of diverse learners. And in your case, the musicians of the future. So thank you.